I wish to draw the attention of Council members to a letter dated 1st September 2020 in document S/2020/883 from the Permanent Representative of Niger to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting concept paper on the item under consideration. I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General and the distinguished heads of state and government, ministers, and other high-level representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, Chairperson of the EU Commission, Moussa Faki Mahamat, Excellencies, thank you for this opportunity to address the subject of global governance as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. The microscopic virus is now the #1 threat in our world. The COVID-19 pandemic is a full-blown crisis in itself, unfolding against the backdrop of high geopolitical tensions and other global threats in unpredictable and dangerous ways. The pandemic is a clear test of international cooperation, a test we have essentially failed. It has killed nearly 1 million people around the world, infected over 30 million, and remains largely out of control. This was the result of a lack of global preparedness, cooperation, unity, and solidarity. The 75th anniversary of the United Nations reminds us of the achievements of our founders and calls on us to live up to their ambitions. We urgently need innovative thinking on global governance and multilateralism so that they are fit for the 21st century. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, first and foremost, we need a network multilateralism based on strong links and cooperation between global and regional organizations, international financial institutions, and other global alliances and institutions. Since I became Secretary General, I have prioritized our strategic partnership with the African Union. Our relations are characterized by shared values, mutual respect, and common interests. The AU-UN partnership is a model we should emulate in our relationships with other regional organizations. We now have a strong AU-UN framework on peace and security on the continent. I urge this Council to deepen our engagement by creating strong, formalized links and regular communications with the African Union's Peace and Security Council. This would enable the most effective division of labor, allowing the African Union to conduct peace enforcement and counterterrorism operations backed by the Security Council mandates with predictable funding guaranteed by assessed contributions. That is the only way we will build the coalition we need to beat terrorism on the African continent and fulfill the African Union's flagship initiative to silence the guns. We at the United Nations also have a responsibility to improve the effectiveness of global governance. Our focus on prevention, our efforts to enhance the peace and security architecture, the Action for Peacekeeping initiative in partnership with member states, and our drive to end sexual exploitation and abuse across the United Nations systems are all aimed at meeting this challenge. I welcome the Security Council Resolution 2532, adopted in July, in support of my appeal for an immediate global ceasefire. We now need a united effort led by this Council to silence the guns around the world by the end of this year. The primary responsibility for making global governance work lies with member states, including those on this Council. Reform of global governance cannot be a substitute for collective action by member states to confront common challenges. Mr. President, conflict, human rights abuses, humanitarian crises, and stalled progress on development reinforce each other and are interlinked. But our global response is more and more fragmented. We are not keeping pace with the world as it is. The institutions of global governance should work together in coordination to contain, mitigate, and reduce risks of all kinds. Network multilateralism must extend beyond peace and security, encompassing the Bretton Woods institutions, development banks, trade alliances, and more. The pandemic is heightening risks across the board. Humanitarian needs are growing, decades of progress on sustainable development are at stake, and social unrest is increasing, thus deepening security risks. Many of the countries in the global south have been left hanging without financial practical resources. Some middle-income countries face a crushing debt burden as they try to respond. From the start, I have advocated for a comprehensive global response package and coordinated action on debt through the mobilization of all partners. We need the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund to support member countries through enhanced access to facilities and tools. And we need greater resources for the IMF and enhanced support from the World Bank Group and other financial institutions' bilateral mechanisms. In May, together with the Prime Ministers of Canada and Jamaica, I brought heads of state and government, leaders of international organizations, representatives from the private sector and civil society together to launch an initiative on financing for development. Within the framework of COVID-19 and in general, this initiative is focusing on areas that are critical to the survival and building a strong recovery, including global liquidity, financial stability, and debt vulnerability. And I look forward to its conclusions next week. But we cannot continue with such ad hoc solutions to systemic, foreseeable global risks. This pandemic is a wake-up call for even more catastrophic challenges that may arise, starting with the climate crisis. If we meet these with the same disunity and disarray we have seen this year, I fear the worst. We need global governance that is resolute, coordinated, flexible, and ready to react to the full range of challenges we face. In a world of interconnected threats, solidarity is self-interest.
Many of the cross-border challenges we face today, from the climate crisis to rising inequality to cybercrime, involve interest groups, businesses, organizations, and entire sectors that are outside traditional concepts of global governance. These challenges cannot be addressed effectively by states alone. We need to broaden our idea of global governance to take in business, civil society, cities and regions, academia and young people. International conventions are not the only way to reach binding agreements for the common good. We need flexible mechanisms in which different stakeholders come together, adopt protocols and codes of conduct, define red lines, and create conditions for successful cooperation, which is particularly relevant in the digital world. Global governance must also recognize our responsibilities to our planet and to future generations. Civil society movements, particularly those led by young people, are global leaders on these issues. Let us face it, global governance mechanisms until now have been exclusive, and the largest group left out in the cold is women, half of humanity. Women watching this week's general debate have a perfect right to feel that they are not represented and their voices are not valued. The COVID-19 pandemic has proven what is obvious. Women's leadership is highly effective. We cannot hope to turn the climate crisis around, reduce social divisions, or make sustained peace without the full contribution of all of society. Reformed global governance is about approaches and institutions which must be reformed and strengthened. We need more and better multilateralism that works effectively and delivers for the people we serve. We need more and better global governance based on national sovereignty and expressed through our shared ideals, eloquently expressed in the United Nations Charter. The pandemic has illustrated beyond dispute the gaps in our multilateral system. As countries go in different directions, the virus goes in every direction. A rational and equitable approach to vaccination would reduce preventable deaths by prioritizing frontline workers and the most vulnerable. But we are struggling to mobilize the resources needed to ensure a vaccine as a global public good, available and affordable to all. We urgently need multilateral institutions that can act decisively based on global consent for the global good. And we need multilateral institutions that are fair, with better representation of the developing world, so that all have a proportional voice at the global table. Mr. President, the General Assembly Declaration on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations has created space for a process of reflection on the future of multilateral cooperation on the post-COVID world. I will report back with analysis and recommendations guided by a common thread of solidarity within and between societies at the national and international levels and with future generations. Our world is no longer bipolar or unipolar. It is moving towards multipolarity. But we experienced fragmentation and polarization without effective mechanisms of multilateral governments 100 years ago. The result was the First World War, followed by the Second. COVID-19 is casting a dark shadow across the world, but it is also a warning that must spur us to action. We have no choice. Either we come together in global institutions that are fit for purpose, or we will be crushed by divisiveness and chaos. Thank you.
Le secrétaire général va...
The Secretary General will have to leave at 11 a.m. due to another engagement. But we would like to thank the Secretary General again for his participation in today's meeting. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Moussa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission.
Excellence, Monsieur Issoufou.
Your Excellency, Mr. Mamadou Issoufou, President of the Republic of Niger, and President of the United Nations Security Council for the month of September 2020, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished members of the Security Council, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first and foremost to warmly congratulate the Republic of Niger, which is exercising the office of the President of the Security Council for this month of September. I extend those congratulations to all the members of the Security Council for having convened today's very important meeting on such a topical issue. It gives us an opportunity to address a matter which is highly relevant: the maintenance of international peace and security and global governance in a post-COVID-19 world. The brief experience of humankind and its various responses to this pandemic has called into question the ability of our institutions to respond to such planet-wide threats. Experience has shown that the health of the human person is a first-rank issue of international peace and security. Adapting our institutions and our tools is an urgent and pressing task. This will require the Security Council to exercise its responsibility as provided for under the Charter of the United Nations. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, the devastations and ravages that followed in the wake of the spread of the pandemic are already well known, and they are considerable in nature. Healthcare networks, our industries, our economies, our educational facilities, our social, cultural and sporting networks have been deeply affected, and hundreds of millions of people have been left exposed to vulnerability, fragility, uncertainty and precariousness. Despite an innovative use of new communication technologies. International diplomatic activity has been seriously interrupted and thrown off track because of the inevitable restrictions on travel, by all means, land, sea and air. Against that backdrop, certain peace processes have become moribund and conflict has become entrenched. Impact on the healthcare networks has led to drastic and painful restrictions by diverting, because resources that should have been focused on healthcare issues have been diverted to conflict prevention or to conflict themselves. In Africa, we are the home of various peacekeeping operations. We have the MNJTF, we have UNAMID, we have the G5 Sahel, all of which were affected. 3,000 additional troops that were supposed to be deployed to the Sahel, for example, have been held up. Armed groups and terrorist organizations have exploited the situation, making hay to continue to push their tactical advantage to intensify their criminal activities. The region of the Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, Somalia, and the Cabo Delgado province in the north of Mozambique are stark illustrations of what I'm speaking of. The pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing inequalities between the rich and poor. It has also exacerbated the vulnerability of women and young girls in particular, who have been subjected to unprecedented levels of domestic violence, including sexual and gender-based violence. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the General Assembly of the United Nations was very effective and efficient in adopting Resolution 74-270 of the 2nd of April 2020, which called for an intensification of international cooperation in order to contain and vanquish the pandemic. Your own body, the Security Council, itself adopted on the 1st of July 2020 Resolution 2532, building further on GA Resolution 74-270, recognizing the unprecedented challenges and threats posed by the pandemic when it comes to international peace and security. It has become clear that this is a major issue, and that is duly captured in Resolution 2532, which we welcome. The WHO has been a model of how to combat this global pandemic, and I congratulate them for their frontline role that they play, not just in the global response to the pandemic, but also in their efforts to try and provide for a COVID-19 vaccine and to support the research towards that vaccine. We should stand foursquare behind the WHO's efforts and all efforts towards a vaccine. It is in that understanding that His Excellency Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, the President of South Africa and the President in Office of the African Union, with the firm support of the African Union Commission, has been championing the African response to the pandemic. Under his leadership, the Bureau of the Conference of Heads of State and Heads of Government in Africa has committed to an unprecedented level of mobilization to give teeth to the continent-wide response strategy. The creation of an African special fund for the COVID-19 response, the mobilization of health equipment, the training of African healthcare professionals, the deployment of special envoys on all fronts, all that we're doing to reduce, suspend, indeed cancel a debt, are some of the fronts we are fighting on in this wide-scale African response. We have been working with various different bodies, including the African CDC, and many of our continent-wide organizations have proven their mettle and their effectiveness and efficiency in response to this pandemic. This pandemic has made it abundantly and painfully clear that humankind is one indivisible family. It has shown that unilateralism is on a hiding to nothing, but it has also shown into stark relief the roadblocks that stand in the way of fully effective multilateralism, and has thrown into stark relief the artificial borders that have been erected between different members of the human family. Africa calls upon all of us to show our determination and to pull together our intelligence and our response in order to ensure a renaissance of multilateralism which stands on our common values. The experience we're currently undergoing, I think, has shown that the people of the world are hungry for effective global governance that can really deliver for them. Before I conclude, I would like to hail the partnership that exists between the African Union and the United Nations and express my gratitude for the leadership and the personal commitment and engagement of the Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres. I wish you every success in your deliberations and endeavours, and I thank you very much indeed for your kind attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Moussa Faki Mohammed for his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as President of Niger. Heads of State and Government, Secretary General of the United Nations, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you very warmly for your effective participation in this high-level meeting of ours. In my capacity as President of the Security Council, it is my honor to be able to have an exchange with you on what the global governance post-COVID-19 should be. Only a crisis felt as such leads to a change. It is being said, well, we had the opportunity to really change things at the 2008 during the financial crisis, but we now have the COVID-19 opportunity to change the global governance. What are the challenges of our time, and what kind of governance can rise to these challenges? The first challenge is the global political governance. In this regard, during the 74th General Assembly session, I already stated that there is a need to support the Secretary General in his efforts aimed at reforming our organization so as to put together a multilateral system which is more democratic. What prevailed 75 years ago is no longer valid today. The functioning of the General Assembly, of the Economic and Social Council, of the Security Council needs to meet the actual situation in the world. In particular, on the issue of the Security Council, where we're meeting today, all of the regions of the world, including Africa, have to be equitably represented. The number of permanent seats has to be increased, and the right of veto has to be removed or extended to the new permanent members to make sure that the body is democratic and equitable. Africa has a common position on this, and it is expressed in its winning consensus. As regards the General Assembly, the constant request from the member states is to make sure that there is a balancing of powers between the Assembly and the Security Council. The challenges we are facing on peace and security, when it comes to the limits of peacekeeping operations, we need to make sure there are collective decisions here, and greater powers are provided under Chapter 7. Notions and realities to develop, and the United Nations has to follow suit. International peace and security are threatened from non-state and terrorist organizations. And to this cannot be accommodated when some states have the right of veto, when they can block the decisions by the international community, even when we have a collective threat, and to do this on the basis of their own interests or ambitions. Furthermore, the risk of a state-to-state confrontation, in particular amongst major states, is not zero. If one of these states falls into this kind of trap, is not to be excluded. So the international community has to think about the possibility, in particular through thinking about denuclearizing the planet. The third challenge is deepening inequalities between countries, and inequalities within countries. The difficulty is not in the shortage of ideas, but rather is trying to avoid the old ideas. And that is why the world usually undergoes reform under a shock. What we have now came in after the oil shocks in 73 and 79. Well, this resulted in such inequalities that the world finds itself in a situation similar to where it was at the end of the 19th century, and the divide between the rich and the poor is deepening, and the middle class is weakening. The gap between the rich and the poor is greater today than it was in the antiquity, where the economy was based on slavery. All of these specialists are saying that in the present context, the trend is going to only increase, and this growing inequality is a great threat that the world community has to face. And let me go back to Article 1 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and let me quote that people are born equal and in possession of all rights. We cannot have a situation which is based on common inequality. They're not always justified. So what we have now is incompatible with the principles of social justice, which is the very foundation of democratic society. And experience shows that the invisible hand of the market cannot correct them. To reduce inequalities, we need not only to invest in training and education, but also to implement expansionist policies and put together a tax on financial transactions, or even a progressive tax on capital. And this would allow to put an end to tax competition which exists among states today. Combating inequalities means that the international financial institutions and the World Bank Group have to work here. The fourth challenge we have is combating poverty. We need to build a world without poverty. And the world without poverty is the very motto of the World Bank. Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that any and all person has a right to a sufficient level of being to provide for his health and well-being of him or herself and her company, to health, housing, and the basic social services. Persons have the right for security in case of unemployment, old age, widowhood, or other cases where means of subsistence are lost, which happened beyond their control. End of quote. And in order to ensure this, we have to declare war against poverty. There is enough wealth in the world to eradicate poverty, and we can vanquish it. Hunger and illness are the two horsemen of apocalypses, and we have to combat them, and we can do that. And these create a fertile ground for terrorism, for example. And that is why an open and candid discussion has to start about basic universal rights for each individual. Experience shows that a universal income, for example, does not lead to laziness. In Niger, we have proof of that. We have an unconditional transfer of money for the benefit of the most vulnerable. Fighting against poverty and unemployment also means sharing the work time and a reform of global economic and financial institutions. and putting an end to the kind of globalization which allows for the free circulation of capital, goods and services, but refuses to allow for free circulation of people. Only 3% of the global population live outside of their country of origin. In Africa, where 90% of poor people live, fighting poverty means massive funding in order to implement the Agenda 2063. The next challenge, ladies and gentlemen, has to do with climate change. Since the beginning of the industrial era, we had models of development which are aggressive towards nature, and this redounds to our disadvantage through extreme climate events, hurricanes, storms, floods, droughts, melting glaciers, rising levels of seas and oceans, coastal erosion, new illnesses, depleting biodiversity, etc. These are all obvious signs of this. Intergovernmental group of climate experts have consistently be drawing attention to global warming. Our method of production is harmful for the environment and for the planet as a whole. World Wildlife Fund considers that about 40% of wildlife species are in the process of disappearing. New paradigm with COVID-19 also has to take this into account and call for a complete and urgent implementation of the Paris Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, we therefore have to face facts and acknowledge that the instruments we had at the end of the Second World War are not sufficient for us today to put an end to poverty, social inequality, climate change, terrorism, organized crime, cybercrime. Is not enough to make sure that we have peaceful coexistence throughout the world. COVID-19 pandemic is the end of an era. It brought into focus for us the need to rethink our collective security system. It also showed us the very nature of our humanity, where all of the countries have found themselves in the same situation, going through the same trouble, powerful or not, rich or poor. We therefore have to all work together in order to draw lessons and think about the necessary reforms necessary for global governance. We have to have a post-COVID-19 world which brings peace, solidarity and prosperity for all. A world where people live with dignity and equality in justice and freedom. I thank you for your kind attention.
I
thank His Excellency, the President of the Security Council, President Issoufou, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, President of South Africa.
President, Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Moussa Faki, the Chairperson of the AU Commission, allow me to begin by congratulating you, Mr. President, and the Republic of Niger on assuming the presidency of the Security Council. Please be assured of South Africa's full support and cooperation. The threat to lives, livelihoods, and social stability posed by COVID-19 has significant consequences for global peace and security. Situations of instability and conflict have the potential to worsen, and there is a possibility of new forms of social unrest that are emerging. Vital gains made in political processes towards peace are also under threat. It is our collective expectation as the international community that the United Nations Security Council will continue to play a key role in ensuring that this pandemic does not undermine international peace and security in any country in the world. It is imperative that the Security Council continues to work closely with regional organizations in this regard, and in our case in Africa, including the African Union. We must coordinate our efforts and strengthen multilateralism if we are to contain the damage that this pandemic could cause. South Africa and the African Union supports the call by the UN Security Secretary General for a global ceasefire and the scaling up of humanitarian assistance to vulnerable societies around the world. South Africa calls on all parties to armed conflict to use this opportunity to work towards peaceful resolution of conflicts, and all of them addressing the humanitarian needs of their own populations. We further support the call for the waiving of unilateral punitive measures, such as sanctions, during the pandemic to enable affected countries to secure much-needed supplies and support. To maintain peace and security, we need a Security Council that better reflects and represents the United Nations membership in keeping with the principle of equality of all nations. This will ensure that the interests of the few will not undermine the efforts at finding solutions to emerging crises that are global in nature. As we look to the post-COVID era process of reconstruction, we have to address the economic, social, humanitarian, and environmental needs of countries. We have to act with urgency to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. As the international community, let us choose cooperation above unilateralism. And we would also say it is best to choose solidarity above isolation. We should also have the courage to choose unity of purpose above narrow self-interest. I'm sure that we can emerge from this great adversity strengthened and even more united. Mr. President, I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Ramaphosa for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Kersti Kaljulaid, President of Estonia.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
All right, that is the debate on the maintenance of international peace and security post COVID-19, hosted by the UN Security Council in New York. We heard there from President Cyril Ramaphosa talking about the fact that he is confident that the Security Council will continue to ensure that this pandemic does not stop peace efforts in the world, saying that South Africa supports a global ceasefire and saying that as we look to post-COVID era, it is important to address economic, social and humanitarian needs of people around the world. All right, we're going to take a short break. Your news after this.
So what are you binge watching right now?
It's a show called Temptation Island.
Tell me about your outsurance story.
I decided, let me give them a try and see what's happening. It was compatible for me.
It was a good temptation.
Change. Ended up saving more than 400 Rand.
Hopefully you won't be tempted to go anywhere else.
Oh no, definitely not. Once you become compatible, you're there to stay.
Wonderful.
SMS saved 44211 or call 08600 60,000 and Chencha Daiding.
In the trenches of business, don't lose sight of the bigger picture. With Nedbank's expertise in cross-border transactions, we'll facilitate growth while optimizing your cash flow. To guide your growth, search Nedbank Bigger Picture Business Banking.
There can be no better way to celebrate our South Africanness than joining the global phenomenon that is spreading across the world, and that is the Jerusalem Dance Challenge. So I urge all of you to take up this challenge on Heritage Day and show the world what we are capable of.
Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami.
All right, that's the Health Ministry there accepting the Jerusalem challenge. I suppose the Health Minister was a little bit too busy to practice. That did seem a bit challenged, but I won't judge. I can't do it. And SABC News hasn't taken the challenge, which I think we should at some stage, hopefully. All right, well, President Cyril Ramaphosa has called on South Africans to continue the fight against gender-based violence. This amid public outrage over a recent string of crimes against women and children. Ramaphosa says that gender-based violence is not part of South Africa's traditions, customs or heritage. The president delivered his Heritage Day message earlier today.
It is important that generations that come after us must fully grasp the importance of the freedom we have all achieved. The men, women, and children of tomorrow must be proud to have inherited a democracy that affirms the worth and dignity of all our citizens. So long as this country's women and children live in fear from violence, we cannot regard ourselves as totally free. So long as women are being harassed, abused, beaten, raped, and murdered, we cannot say we are a civilized society. Abusing women is not our tradition, nor is it our custom. It is not and will never be our heritage. Throughout the history of this continent, women have built and shaped our societies. They have ruled kingdoms. They have been highly respected and valued. We must put an end to this terrible shame that is tainting the image of our country. When you oppress a woman, you oppress a nation. When you beat a woman, you beat a nation. We must do away with practices that discriminate against women. With the same determination, we must stand firm against attempts to disrespect our country's women through crude forms of representation in the media, in advertising, and in popular culture. An offensive hair advertisement that was recently published shows that we still have a long way to go. The apartheid government denigrated our cultures and tried to make us ashamed of our cultures, our traditions, our languages, and our very appearances. It is disheartening to see that in democratic South Africa, there are still crude stereotypes of black women being put on public display. The social cohesion we seek in this country means we must be mindful of the legacy of our past, whether we are businesses selling products, whether we are producers of content for television or otherwise.
All right, a message from the President as we celebrate Heritage Day, saying that GBV does not form part of South Africa's heritage. We're going to take you back to that debate on the maintenance of international peace and security post-COVID-19 that is being hosted by the UN Security Council. I do believe that the President of Tunisia is now speaking.
In this regard, I fully agree with the Secretary General in his description of the current crisis as, and I quote, the greatest test the international community has faced since the organization was formed, end of quote. Tunisia was one of the first countries to draw the attention of the international community to the impact of the pandemic on humanity as a whole and its destructive effects on peace and security and all aspects of life. In this context, I called for adopting a new approach towards international security based on enhancing cooperation and synergy among countries and people, as we believe that no single country, no matter how powerful it might be, would be able to confront this invisible enemy, this transnational enemy alone. We all have the same fate. Our collective peace and safety depends on the peace and safety of every single individual without exception. Against this background, Tunisia, in coordination with France, proposed a draft resolution to the Security Council in a second phase, where we stressed that fighting the pandemic requires more international solidarity, a comprehensive, coordinated, common, coherent response under the supervision of the United Nations. We called for a comprehensive and immediate ceasefire all around the world. We called for observing a humanitarian truce in all conflict zones, in line with the Secretary General's call. We express our appreciation to the Security Council for unanimously adopting said resolution on the 1st of July 2020. Today, we stressed the importance of implementing this resolution and following up on this implementation by relevant parties, especially in light of the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in a number of conflict zones as a result of the pandemic, such as Syria, Yemen, Libya, the Sahel region, Afghanistan, and other regions. The adoption of said resolution sent a positive message on the engagement of the Council in the fight against COVID-19. However, it took 4 months of arduous negotiations that showed the deep divisions inside the Security Council. They have adversely affected the ability of the Council to address the issues on its agenda, especially protracted issues that have deep effects at all levels, chief among which the just Palestinian cause. This proves that we need to accelerate the process of reforming the Security Council so that it becomes more flexible, so that the decision-making process becomes faster and more flexible. Mr. President, the immediate and direct consequences of the pandemic on the global health situation should not obscure the social and economic impacts. It expected that the economic consequences will be the worst since the last century, or maybe in the history of All indications suggest that the global economy will see a contraction of more than 5%. It is likely that this will be followed by a financial crisis in many parts of the world that will ravage the economies of many countries and that will push millions of people towards poverty and unemployment. There is no doubt that these consequences will be more devastating in developing countries, especially for vulnerable groups that will become poorer and that will suffer more. The latest estimates of the Food and Agricultural Organization indicate that the global recession resulting from the decline of commercial activity will add 132 million people to the category of people suffering from hunger. The current figure stands at 690 million people. You all know that such factors can fuel tension and conflicts around the world. They can lead to a cycle of conflicts, one leading to another. One conflict would breed a number of conflicts.
وذلك يطرح علينا جميعا يطرح علينا تحديات جديدة.
This would pose additional challenges, and it would make it incumbent upon the United Nations to go beyond the traditional concept of security that does not encompass all risks that confront humanity or might confront humanity in the future. We must develop a new concept that includes non-traditional security threats, such as pandemics, environmental disasters, effects of climate change, and cybercrimes. The magnitude and the complex nature of the challenges we're facing and that have exacerbated as a result of this pandemic stress the importance of solidarity, the importance of making concerted efforts, especially efforts by rich countries, to combat poverty and marginalization and to enhance social integration and fight environmental challenges. In this regard, Tunisia calls upon the international community to continue providing the necessary support to the African continent and to help it use its potentials and increase its chances to achieve development by restructuring foreign debts. That would contribute to fulfilling the aspirations of our peoples to more security, stability, development, and the enjoyment of all human rights, especially economic, social, and cultural rights. Mr. President, the pandemic changed and will further change international relations. Some believe it might lay the foundation for a new global order with new concepts, with innovative mechanisms of work. These changes prompt us to think about the future of global governance that will most definitely be different to pre-COVID times. In this context, we call for consolidating our common awareness, our awareness of human values, to encourage cooperation and to build a global order that is more just, and to work collectively to turn this crisis into a new beginning, through which we can establish new governance models in all fields, models that are able to confront different challenges in the present and in the future. This will only be possible if we draw the lessons learned, if we reconsider the priorities of our societies, if we uphold the values of solidarity and cooperation that are the source of strength for societies to respond to crises and challenges. Mr. President, I would like to stress once again that the social and economic effects of this pandemic, of this new normal, can go on for an extended period of time. Overcoming these consequences require change, require reconsidering the current global governance. We must reconsider a number of existing concepts, including the concept of security and the value systems based upon which international relations are based. We must develop a new development system as well that would pave the way for a better life for the upcoming generations. In conclusion, I would like to stress that Tunisia is committed to cooperation, committed to contributing to developing a new vision for cooperation, a vision that all parties agree to, to address the immediate consequences of the pandemic and to curb its spread. A vision that would allow for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda. A vision that would allow for leaving no one behind, to uphold human dignity, and to allow the people of the world to use their potential in achieving sustainable development and demonstrating solidarity. May the peace and mercy of God be upon you.
I now give the floor to the representative of China. Mr. Wang Yi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of China.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, as the world commemorates the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, the Security Council is holding this summit debate proposed by President Mahamadou Issoufou to discuss COVID-19 global governance. China welcomes and supports this initiative. I listened carefully to the interventions by the leaders, including President Faki. We commend our commitment to multilateralism in a bid to enhance global governance. We fully support Secretary General Guterres' all-along initiative on a global ceasefire. Earlier this week, President Xi Jinping spoke at the high-level meeting on the 75th anniversary of the UN and at the general debate. He addressed a series of key questions from a strategic, long-term, and historical perspective. What kind of world will we, humanity, live in? What kind of country will China look like? And what kind of UN is needed for the world? The answers, as President Xi underlined, lie in the steadfast commitment to the path of multilateralism and to the UN-centered international system, and a joint efforts to build a community with a shared future for humankind and new type of international relations. Many leaders have also recalled the founding missions of the UN, expressed strong support for multilateralism, and displayed a shared aspiration for defeating COVID-19 with solidarity and pursuing peace and development. As we meet, global threats and challenges continue to rise. The solution urgently requires improved global governance and closer coordination and cooperation. Meanwhile, developing countries are rising collectively. The global governance system needs to reflect the reality of the international politics and the process toward a multipolar world. We need to follow the trend of the times, strengthen top-level design, and improve the global governance system through reform. To this end, China would like to propose the following 5 points. First, we need to act on the principle of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits. All countries, big or small, are equal members of the international community. Major risks and challenges respect no borders and impact the future of each and every country alike. To tackle them requires strong synergy supported by a global pooling of resources and wisdom. Global affairs must be discussed by all, governance systems built by all, and benefits of governance shared by all, so that every country is a participant, contributor, and beneficiary of world peace and development. Developing countries are faced with greater difficulties. There is every need to make sure that their voices are heard, their concerns are respected, and their rights and interests are safeguarded, which is an embodiment of international justice. Second, we need to jointly tackle non-traditional security threats. The first 2 decades of the 21st century have seen the onset of numerous global risks and challenges, from the September 11 attacks to the global financial crisis to COVID-19. Traditional and non-traditional security threats should be managed holistically. Public health and climate change should be given greater priority on the international agenda. Non-traditional security threats, often multifaceted, can only be effectively tackled with comprehensive, well-calibrated efforts to address both the symptoms and root causes. Here's where the Security Council needs to play a bigger role pursuant to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Third, we need to enhance coordination and cooperation among major countries. Global governance will be strengthened when major countries set an example of acting on the UN Charter, providing global public goods, and contributing to world peace and development. In such a challenging moment, major countries are even more duty-bound to put the future of humankind first, discard Cold War mentality and ideological bias, and come together in the spirit of partnership to tide over the difficulties. Fourth, we need to uphold international law and rules. A sound global governance architecture must be undergirded by respect for law and rules. All must adhere to the basic norms governing international relations, such as sovereign equality, non-interference in internal affairs, and peaceful settlement of disputes. Rules must be followed and commitments must be kept. Unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction need to be opposed in order to safeguard the authority and sanctity of international law. Laws and rules need to keep pace with the changing times. The international community needs to establish rules in frontier areas, such as the deep sea, polar region, cyberspace, and outer space, to regulate their development and ensure equitable benefits to all countries. Fifth, we need to bring the role of the UN to bear. The global risks and challenges we face are crises with compounded effects, which cannot be addressed separately. As the most universal, representative, and authoritative international institution, the UN is better positioned and capable to play a leadership role than any country or international organization. Meanwhile, the body needs to evolve with the times, increase representation and voice of the developing countries, raise its efficiency and emergency preparedness, and build an up-to-date governance system and capability. The Security Council, the centerpiece of the collective security framework, is part and parcel of the global governance system, and tasked with the primary responsibility for international peace and security. Under the new conditions, the Council needs to effectively fulfill the duties conferred by the UN Charter, contribute to the maintenance of world peace and the stability of international order, ensure security to all peoples, and bring hope to global governance. China will continue to work with countries around the world to improve the global governance system and build a community with a shared future for humankind. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Mr. Sergei Lavrov. You have the floor.
I'm sorry, there's no sound.
Mr. Minister, unfortunately we can't hear you. Can you hear us? Your Excellency, we cannot hear you. What is being tested now is not just individual states, but also global governance mechanism as such, and the UN is first and foremost here. What we need to do is to draw timely lessons from what is happening, draw the right conclusions to make sure that we have peaceful, safe and stable future for the whole humankind. The main thing that the current crisis has shown is that the interdependence, interconnectedness of all states without exception in all areas of public life. Russia has long been drawing attention to the cross-border nature of contemporary threats, including international terrorism, the danger of uncontrolled proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, cybercrime, trafficking, etc. Now, when we have the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic on top of that, our appeals to come up with joint responses to global challenges are becoming even more relevant. The events this year have shown that no one can just simply cordon themselves off from these threats. The coronavirus infection has impacted everyone, and this means that overcoming its consequences is something that we need to do together and to push, therefore, away our momentary differences. Unfortunately, our common misfortune did not iron out interstate differences, but to the contrary, deepen them. The crisis points have come to the fore, the very points that we have been witnessing in international relations earlier as well. In a whole number of countries, there is a temptation to look abroad for those who are responsible for their own internal problems. And we see attempts on the part of individual countries to use the current situation in order to move forward their narrow interests of the moment in order to settle a score with the undesirable governments or geopolitical competitors. Against all odds, we are still seeing the practice of unilateral illegitimate sanctions. They undermine the prestige and prerogatives of the United Nations Security Council. We have on many occasions drawn attention to the need to do away with the restrictions. In the context of a pandemic, they hit particularly hard those who are most vulnerable. They limit their access to foodstuffs and health care. Suspending such measures in the current conditions is also something that the Secretary General called for, and we actively support this initiative of his. What remains fully relevant and topical as well is a proposal put forward by President Putin at the April summit of the G20. He proposed the so-called red corridors, which would be free of sanctions and trade wars. It is regrettable that states which use the illegal sanctions in their policies remain deaf to our arguments. And what is even more regrettable, they remain deaf to the vital needs of the simple people from all corners of the world. We are deeply convinced that international efforts in order to overcome the crisis need to be coordinated and conducted with the central role being played by the UN. The UN remains a universal and indispensable platform for dialogue, and its importance for the global architecture in a pandemic has only increased. In this regard, we think it's absolutely unfair to increasingly attack the UN system as a whole and its specialized agencies in particular. And this, first and foremost, means the World Health Organization. According to the absolute majority of countries, at all stages of the crisis, the World Health Organization acted professionally, in a timely manner, provided effective preventive steps, and did this in a close contact with all member states. Of course, the potential of the international healthcare system is something that needs to be qualitatively built upon, and Russia has contributed to that greatly. We were the first country in the world which developed and registered a coronavirus vaccine, Sputnik V, and we reiterate our readiness to cooperate epidemiologically with all interested states and international organizations. As recently as the day before yesterday, when speaking in the General Assembly, President Putin offered free vaccination to the UN staff. This is our reaction to the requests which came from the UN colleagues, and Russia, of course, as was underscored by Mr. Putin, could not remain indifferent to such requests. He also proposed that we organize a video conference of all countries which are involved in the development and manufacturing coronavirus vaccine, and this proposal remains on the negotiating table. The pandemic today has begun exactly that kind of shift. The the black swan which has put us face to face with a challenge, with a choice. We can close in upon ourselves, accuse others of the crisis, or come out of the crisis together, pool the efforts of all countries and peoples. The choice seems obvious, and yet the latter option requires maximum political will and strategic thinking. We think we need to start with an open and candid dialogue first and foremost amongst the prominent members of the Security Council, members which under the Charter bear special responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. And it is in this line that Russia launched the initiative to convene a summit of the P5 countries, and this was mentioned by President Putin yesterday when he addressed the General Assembly. In-person discussion amongst leaders about the principles of interstate interaction, the most acute problems that humankind faces, would be an important step in order to strengthen the collective approach in international affairs and towards restoring global strategic stability in the post-pandemic period. And of course, this is the meeting we are convinced that we need to convene as soon as the international epidemiological situation allows. We also need to strengthen the existing formats of interaction where the principles of equality, cooperation and consensus reign. And such formats are the G20, BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We are convinced that the future of global governance belongs with the entities which provide for a flexible reaction to emerging challenges without taking away from the UN-centric nature of international architecture. In October, Russia will be presiding over the deliberation of the Security Council. We'll make maximum efforts to ensure coordinated and effective work of this main body of the United Nations, and we'll base our work on constructive interaction of all its members, and we'll base ourselves on the standards of international law, first and foremost the objectives and principles of the UN Charter. I would like to yet once again thank the Presidency of Niger for this very useful initiative, and I thank you for your attention. I now give the floor to the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, at the outset, St. Vincent and the Grenadines extends our compliments to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, and the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Moussa Faki Mahamat. We thank you both.
All right, we heard from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China, Mr. Wang Yi, as well as the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, interestingly rebuking the tendency of countries to look abroad to solve internal issues, which is rather interesting given the fact that the President of Tunisia, Kais Saied, stressed the importance of solidarity of countries, calling upon the international community to continue to support the African continent to fulfill the aspirations of its people for security, stability and peace, as well as the enjoyment of human rights. So that is the debate on the maintenance of international peace and security post-COVID-19. Russia having something different to say there. It is hosted indeed by the UN Security Council in New York, and certainly we heard earlier on from our President Cyril Ramaphosa, saying he's confident that the Security Council will continue to ensure that the pandemic does not stop peace efforts throughout the world. We're going to take a short break and more news after this.